In 1982, the Argentine military sat down with their intelligence reports and did the math. They studied the aircraft Britain would send to defend its fleet. They looked at the numbers. Top speed Mach 0.97, not supersonic. The radar system a basic pulse unit, one full generation behind what the Americans and Soviets were flying. Missile capacity 2, just 2. While an American F-15 Eagle could carry 8 missiles in a mixed configuration. The Argentine analysts wrote their conclusion into the official record, and those words were later preserved in a post-war assessment published by the Marine Corps University. They called the British aircraft an insignificant threat to the task force. 3 words, insignificant threat. 10 weeks later, 20 Argentine aircraft had been destroyed in air-to-air combat. Not a single Sea Harrier had been shot down by an enemy fighter. Not one. And every air force on the planet was placing orders. But that is not the full story, not even close. The full story includes the name that the pilots themselves gave this aircraft. Not the name on the museum placard. Not the name in the recruitment poster. The name that comes from the men who strapped into the cockpit and felt what it actually felt like to trust your life to something this extraordinary and this unforgiving. That name will make complete sense before the story is over. But first, you need to understand what this aircraft was, where it came from, and why the whole world had already written it off before the first shot was fired. The story begins not in the South Atlantic. It begins in a quiet English county on a cool October morning in 1960 at an airfield called Dunsfold in Surrey. A prototype sat on the tarmac that day. It was not a beautiful machine. It did not have the sleek, menacing profile of a supersonic fighter. It had 4 strange exhaust nozzles jutting from its sides, 2 forward and 2 aft, and it looked frankly peculiar next to anything else on that field. Engineers had tethered it to the ground with steel cables because what they were about to attempt had never been done before in the history of powered flight. Not like this, not with a jet. On October 21st, 1960, the P-1127 prototype lifted itself straight up off the ground. No runway, no catapult, no assistance of any kind. It just rose. The tether cables went taut and then slack again as the machine hovered in place, trembling slightly, balanced on nothing but a column of directed thrust. The men watching from the field went quiet. Some of them, the ones who had been told this was impossible, went very quiet indeed. What made it work was a single inspired piece of engineering. Sir Stanley Hooker at Bristol Siddeley had designed an engine called the Pegasus with a characteristic unlike anything else in the world. It had 4 exhaust nozzles, and those nozzles could rotate. When they pointed backward, the aircraft flew like a conventional jet. When they pointed downward, the thrust lifted the machine straight into the air. The transition between those 2 states, the moment when a pilot converted a flying aircraft into a hovering one, or a hovering one back into a flying aircraft, was where physics became extremely unforgiving. But we will come back to that. The man whose dream started all of this was Sir Sidney Cam. He had already designed the Hawker Hurricane, the aircraft that fought in the Battle of Britain. He was in his 60s by the time the P-1127 flew, and most men his age in the aviation world were writing memoirs. Cam was designing something that had never existed. Alongside him was Ralph Hooper, the younger engineer, who translated the vision into metal and numbers. Together, they were chasing a military reality that suddenly seemed very urgent. The year was 1960. The Cold War was hardening into something permanent and terrifying. Soviet doctrine called for massive missile strikes against NATO airfields in the opening minutes of any European war. Every jet fighter in the Western inventory needed a long concrete runway to take off. Long concrete runways were targets. You could destroy them with a single well-placed ballistic missile strike. If the runways went down, the fighters stayed on the ground. And if the fighters stayed on the ground, Western Europe was finished. Unless you had a fighter that did not need a runway. That was the idea. That was what Cam and Hooper were building. And through the Kestrel evaluation program in the mid-1960s, where pilots from Britain, the United States, and West Germany all took turns flying the developing concept, the machine evolved from experimental curiosity into something militarily serious. In 1969, the Harrier GR-1 entered Royal Air Force service with No. 1 Squadron. And in 1980, the naval version, the Sea Harrier FERS-1, joined the fleet aboard the new Invincible-class carriers. 2 years. The Sea Harrier had been in service for just 2 years when the call came. But before we get to the call, you need to understand one thing that almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. One fact that if you sit with it for a moment will change how you see everything that follows. In 1981, 1 year before the war, the British government was preparing to sell HMS Invincible. The defense secretary at the time was John Nott. His 1981 defense white paper was a document of cuts and compromises shaped by a government that was trying to reduce spending wherever it could. The paper proposed selling HMS Invincible to the Royal Australian Navy. It proposed reducing the Fleet Air Arm's fixed-wing capability to almost nothing. The admirals who believed in the Sea Harrier were arguing against their own government fighting to preserve an aircraft that Whitehall regarded as a poor substitute for the Phantoms and Buccaneers the Royal Navy had been forced to give up in the 1970s. The deal was being actively negotiated. Contracts were being drafted. If that sale had been completed 6 months earlier than it eventually stalled, Britain would have entered the Falklands War with one aging carrier instead of two. One carrier carrying roughly 12 aircraft, against 82 Argentine combat jets flying from protected mainland bases. The margin between the history that happened and the history that could have happened was a matter of weeks in a contract negotiation. Hold that thought as we continue. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. The small British garrison, around 80 Royal Marines and a handful of naval personnel, fought hard but could not hold against overwhelming numbers. By noon, the Argentine flag was flying over Stanley, the island capital. London had hours to decide how to respond. 3 days later, on April 5th, the British task force sailed from Portsmouth. People lined the harbor to watch them go. Families stood on the docks with children on their shoulders. Military bands played. Flags moved in the spring wind. The images from that day have a particular quality that photographs from significant moments often have a sense that everyone present understood at some level that they were watching something that might not come back the same way it left. Aboard HMS Hermes, the older and larger of the two carriers, 12 Sea Harriers of 800 Naval Air Squadron were secured below decks. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld, a man whose leadership style was the opposite of theatrical. Competent, precise, and driven entirely by what his pilots needed, rather than what might make good copy in the newspapers. Aboard HMS Invincible, the newer carrier, 8 Sea Harriers of 801 Naval Air Squadron waited under their own covers. Their commanding officer was Commander Nigel Ward. The men who served under him called him Sharky, and the name fit. Ward was one of the finest air combat pilots in the Royal Navy, and everyone knew it, including Ward himself. He was brilliant and combative and completely certain of his own judgments, which made him the kind of leader you desperately want in combat and cannot quite figure out what to do with in peacetime. He would later write a memoir of the campaign that generated controversy in naval circles for decades because Ward said exactly what he thought about every decision that had been made, including the ones made by people still alive and serving. Some loved him for it, others did not. In April of 1982, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he could fly. 20 aircraft. That was the total. 20 Sea Harriers to provide air defense for an entire naval task force operating 8,000 miles from home, against an Argentine Air Force that could put 82 combat jets into the sky from mainland bases, against pilots who were trained, experienced, and flying aircraft that on paper were superior in almost every measurable category. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. Lose 5 or 6 in the opening engagements, and the task force would have no air cover. No air cover meant no safe amphibious landing. No landing meant no ground campaign. No ground campaign meant the Falklands remained Argentine. The whole thing could end before it started, but the arithmetic had not yet accounted for two things it had no way to account for. We will come to both of them. For now, understand the scale of what these men were sailing toward. The carriers themselves presented a problem that rarely gets the attention it deserves. HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible were not supercarriers. They were not the Nimitz-class ships that the United States Navy operated with their steam catapults and 4-acre flight decks and ability to launch a 40,000-pound aircraft from 0 to 165 miles per hour in 2 seconds. The British ships had no catapults at all. What they had instead was a ski jump, a curved ramp at the bow of each ship that launched Sea Harriers into the air on an upward trajectory. The physics of this mattered enormously. A flat deck rolling takeoff would have forced pilots to leave the ship carrying either enough fuel to reach the combat area or enough weapons to do something useful when they got there. Not both. The ski jump changed that equation. By projecting the aircraft upward at the moment of launch, it gave the Pegasus engine those extra fractions of a second needed to generate lift, allowing pilots to take off carrying both a full fuel load and a full weapons load. At a range of 8,000 miles from any friendly airfield, every extra minute of patrol time and every additional missile was the difference between mission capable and mission incomplete. It was a solution born from constraint, from the British experience of making do with less and finding something better on the other side of the limitation. There was another constraint that forced another improvisation. 20 aircraft were not enough. Everyone knew it. The reinforcement plan required getting additional Sea Harriers and RAF Harrier, GR-3S into the combat zone, but there were not enough warships to carry them. So the planners looked at what was available, and what was available was a merchant vessel. MV Atlantic Conveyor was a container ship. She was built to move commercial cargo across the Atlantic Ocean. She had no armored flight deck, no firefighting systems designed for aviation fuel, no blast deflectors, no arresting gear, no accommodation for pilots or maintenance crews operating jets. Within days of being requisitioned by the Ministry of Defense, dock workers and military engineers worked around the clock to transform her. Helicopter landing pads were welded onto her structure. Sea Harriers and RAF Harrier GR-3s were loaded onto her open deck and secured with chains and improvised tie-down points. She had no protection against the elements and no protection against the weapons that were already being deployed in the South Atlantic, including the Exocet missile. The crews who lived and worked on that open deck during the voyage south did so with a specific and unspoken knowledge. Aviation fuel and armed aircraft on a cargo ship with no aviation firefighting systems in waters where a hostile aircraft could arrive with minimal warning. A single fire in the wrong place and nothing aboard would survive. They worked their shifts anyway. The transfer of aircraft from Atlantic Conveyor to the carriers had to be done at sea in South Atlantic weather, with pilots performing vertical takeoffs from a pitching cargo deck and vertical landings on carriers that were themselves moving through heavy swells. Every single transfer was what pilots call a white-knuckle evolution. The margin between a successful hover and losing a 9-ton jet over the side was measured in feet and fractions of a second. They transferred every aircraft successfully. By the time the campaign was over, 28 Sea Harriers and 10 RAF Harrier GR-3S were operating in the combat zone. But that is the end of the counting. Before we get there, meet the enemy, because this story will not be honest if it treats them as background. The Fuerza Aérea Argentina, the Argentine Air Force, was not a collection of poorly trained pilots flying obsolete machines. The men who would be sent against the British task force were professional aviators, flying aircraft that were in several cases genuinely superior to the Sea Harrier on conventional performance measures. The Dassault Mirage. AUIA was a French-built supersonic interceptor capable of Mach 2.2. It had radar, genuine radar, a Cyrano 4 set that was a full generation more advanced than the Sea Harrier's Blue Fox. Argentine pilots had been training on it for years. The IAI Dagger was an Israeli-built variant of the Mirage 5, a fast, agile ground attack aircraft that had seen real combat in the Middle East. The pilots who flew it were experienced and aggressive. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk was a combat-proven American design with a record stretching back to Vietnam. The Argentine Skyhawk pilots had a reputation built over years of serious training, and that reputation was earned. They were known for pressing attacks through conditions that would have turned back less committed men. Against these aircraft and these pilots, the Sea Harrier had one thing going for it on paper, and that was its vertical flight capability. In a dogfight, speed matters, and the Mirage was faster. Radar matters, and the Mirage had better radar. Missile capacity matters, and the F-15, which NATO pilots flew, carried more missiles. What the Sea Harrier had was something no one had yet used in actual combat, and that something was about to get its first real test. But before May 1st arrives on the calendar, let us spend a moment on the specific human being who would fire the first shot. His name was Paul Barton. Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, Royal Air Force. Not Royal Navy, Air Force. Barton was serving with 801 Naval Air Squadron on HMS Invincible, on an exchange tour, the kind of arrangement where a pilot from one service branch spends time operating with another, broadening experience and building interoperability. In the insular world of naval aviation, an RAF officer serving aboard a carrier was something of an outsider. Not unwelcome, just different. He had earned his place through competence, which was the only currency that mattered in a cockpit. He was precise, disciplined, and possessed of the particular calm that distinguishes genuinely exceptional combat pilots from merely excellent ones. He had no way of knowing that morning of May 1st, 1982, that his name was about to be permanently inscribed in the history of naval aviation. The task force had arrived in the waters around the Falklands. The first operations were launching. Aircraft from 800 NAS on Hermes were conducting strikes against the Argentine-held airfield at Stanley. Aircraft from 801 NAS on Invincible were flying combat air patrol, which means they were up there watching, waiting position between the task force and anything Argentina might send to challenge it. Barton was in the air. His Blue Fox radar was scanning. The sky over the South Atlantic that morning was the particular shade of gray that anyone who has spent time at sea in the Southern Hemisphere will recognize, a gray that seems to press down from above and rise up from the water simultaneously, a gray that makes distances uncertain and reference points unreliable. His radar screen showed a contact. Inbound. Fast. Very fast. What was coming at him was a Mirage IAMA, a machine capable of Mach 2.2, a machine designed specifically to intercept and destroy targets at supersonic speeds. A machine that looked on paper like it had no business being challenged by anything Barton was flying. Barton maneuvered to intercept. The Mirage pilot was doing what Mirage pilots were trained to do, using altitude and speed as weapons, pressing the engagement on terms that favored the faster aircraft. Argentine pilots had been trained to deal with older Sidewinder missiles by presenting their cold side turning to put the hot exhaust of their engine away from the infrared seeker head of the incoming weapon. That tactic had worked for years. It had been tested in exercises. It had been validated by experience. It was about to become a death sentence, because beneath the wings of Barton's Sea Harrier hung something that the Argentine Air Force had not fully accounted for. Something the United States had quietly provided to Britain in the weeks before the task force sailed. Something that did not care which direction a target was facing. The AIM-9L Sidewinder, Lima variant, the first all-aspect infrared guided missile ever fielded in combat. Every previous Sidewinder and every similar weapon in any inventory anywhere in the world at that time required a rear hemisphere shot. The seeker head tracked heat, and the primary heat source on any jet aircraft is the exhaust nozzle at the back. You had to be behind your target to fire. Getting behind a faster, more maneuverable aircraft was the entire problem that air combat tactics existed to solve. The Lima did not care about any of that. Its seeker head could acquire and lock onto a target from any angle. Head on, broadside, below, above. The target did not need to be turning away. The target did not need to be doing anything in particular except existing in the sky within range. A post-war analyst called it Her Majesty's Death Ray. The phrasing is theatrical, but the underlying point is accurate. Barton acquired the Mirage visually against the gray southern sky. He pressed the firing button. The Lima dropped from its pylon. The rocket motor ignited. The seeker head, already locked, followed its instruction without hesitation. The Mirage disappeared in fire. Paul Barton, Royal Air Force, serving on exchange with 801 Naval Air Squadron, had just scored the first Air 2 air kill in Sea Harrier history. Not a Navy pilot, an Air Force officer, a guest, a man who was technically there as a visitor. Minutes later, Lieutenant Steve Thomas of 801 NAS destroyed a second Mirage in a separate engagement. By the end of that first day, several Argentine aircraft had been destroyed. The Sea Harrier had not lost a single airframe in air-to-air combat. The pattern that had just been established would hold without exception for the next 74 days. But there was something else happening in those early engagements. Something harder to quantify than a kill score. Something that operated not in the realm of ballistics or radar or infrared sensors, but in the realm of psychology. Argentine pilots returning to their bases on the mainland were carrying back a piece of information that none of their training had prepared them for. The weapon that killed their colleagues had come from an angle they had been told was safe. The maneuver they had used to survive 100 training exercises had failed. And worse, there was something about the Sea Harrier itself, something about what it was capable of doing in close quarters combat that was beginning to work on them in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. Because the Lima was only half of it. The other half was what the Sea Harrier could do with its nozzles when the missiles had already flown and two aircraft were suddenly very close together and moving very fast. Picture a turning fight, two aircraft pulling hard in circles, each one trying to get behind the other. The physics of that circle are fixed. Airspeed and wing loading set limits that cannot be exceeded. Every pilot on Earth knows those limits. They are the fundamental constants of close air combat. You train around them, you exploit them, you accept them as the boundaries of the possible. Unless you have four rotating exhaust nozzles and the skill to use them. A Sea Harrier pilot in a turning fight could reach for a lever beside the throttle and rotate the Pegasus nozzles partially forward. The thrust that had been driving the aircraft forward was now directed partly backward and downward. The aircraft decelerated with a violence that no air brake or throttle reduction could match. The turn radius tightened in ways that pure aerodynamics could not achieve. And to the pursuing pilot, the aircraft in front of him appeared to nearly stop in midair. He could not slow down fast enough to match it. He overshot. He went from the killing position behind the Harrier to the dead position in front of it. And in the 2 or 3 seconds that transition took, the Harrier pilot had already rotated his nozzles back to full, aft thrust accelerated out of the reversal, and was looking at the tailpipe of the aircraft that had just been trying to kill him. This technique is called VIFF, vectoring in forward flight. How much it was actually used in specific engagements during the Falklands campaign is a question that honest analysts still debate. Sharkey Ward himself was characteristically direct on the subject after the war. He emphasized that tactical disciplined teamwork in the Lima were the decisive factors. Some pilots said they used partial nozzle vectoring in certain engagements. Others said the Lima was so effective at finishing fights quickly that genuine knife range was rarely reached. What is beyond debate is this: Argentine pilots knew the Sea Harrier could do something that nothing else in the sky could do. They had been briefed on it. They understood that if they got into close combat with one of these aircraft, the normal rules of physics did not apply. That knowledge did not make them cowards. It made them cautious at moments when caution shortened the engagement window. In air combat, caution is measured in fractions of a second, and fractions of a second determine who goes home. The psychological pressure of that uncertainty, the knowledge that the aircraft you were pursuing might at any moment appear to stop and turn inside you, was a weight that Argentine pilots carried into every intercept. Whether the VIFF was used or not, the possibility of it was always there, and the Lima was always ready. The score at the end of the first week was not an anomaly. It was a pattern establishing itself. The Sea Harrier, subsonic short-range 2-missile radar limited, dismissed by NATO pilots as a clever trick and dismissed by Argentine intelligence as an insignificant threat, was systematically and completely destroying everything sent against it. But the war was not over. Not even close. The hardest day was still coming. The 21st of May, 1982 began before dawn. In the dark water of San Carlos Sound, a narrow stretch of ocean pressed between the hills of East and West Falkland, the ships of the British task force were moving into position. Destroyers and frigates formed a protective screen around the troop transports and amphibious assault vessels at the center. Thousands of Royal Marines and paratroopers were below decks, checking equipment, sitting with their thoughts, doing what soldiers have always done in the hours before an assault. Some of them were writing letters. Some of them were very quiet. Some of them were doing the ordinary human things that people do when they are not certain they will have another opportunity. The plan was to put them ashore at San Carlos, to establish a beachhead on the Falklands that would become the foundation of a land campaign to retake Stanley. Without that beachhead, the war was a naval standoff with no resolution. With it, the war became something Britain could actually win. The Argentine Air Command understood this as clearly as anyone. They also understood that the ships in San Carlos water would be nearly stationary while they offloaded troops and supplies. Stationary ships are ideal targets. The hills surrounding the sound would compress the approach angles for attacking aircraft, channeling them in ways that made certain tactics both more dangerous and more necessary. And the sheer volume of material that needed to come ashore meant the ships would be there for hours exposed, not running, not maneuvering, sitting in what would very quickly earn a name that nobody planned for. Bomb alley. From bases on the Argentine mainland, the strike packages launched in waves. A 4 Skyhawks loaded with bombs. I daggers coming in fast and low. Mirage variants of different configurations. Pilots who had trained for exactly this kind of mission, who understood that what they were being asked to do was dangerous beyond any ordinary calculation, and who flew toward it anyway because that is what they had come here to do. They came in low, very low. Low enough that the wakes of their aircraft disturbed the surface of the water. Low enough that anti-aircraft gunners on the British ships had to lower their barrels to angles they had not expected to use. Low enough that the hills on either side of the sound seemed to frame each approach like walls, and the narrow strip of water in the middle felt to everyone present like a killing ground with no comfortable side. Sharkey Ward was airborne before most of the first wave arrived. He was leading a section from 801 NAS out of Invincible Flying Combat Air Patrol above and around the sound, positioned to intercept incoming Argentine aircraft before they could reach the ships below. The briefings had been clear about what this day meant. Every Argentine aircraft that reached those ships was not an abstraction. It was a bomb aimed at a transport vessel full of men who had not yet set foot on the island they had sailed 8,000 miles to reach. Ward's radar picked up a formation of daggers coming in from the west. The dagger was a capable machine. The pilots flying them on that day were not timid men. They were pressing this attack, flying the profile they had been trained to fly, committed to the mission, in a way that demanded a certain kind of recognition, even from the people trying to kill them. They were brave, they were skilled, and they were flying directly toward a weapon they had not yet fully experienced. Ward acquired the trailing dagger in the formation. The Lima Seeker head growled its locked tone in his headset, that particular sound that every fighter pilot who has ever heard it describes differently, but remembers with absolute clarity, the sound that means the geometry is right and the physics will do the rest. He fired. The dagger vanished into a fireball that rolled across the hillside of West Falkland. Ward pulled his aircraft around hard, looking for the next target, thinking in the compressed and ruthlessly prioritized way that combat demands. Not about what he had just done, about what needed to happen next. About the ships below, and the men on them, and the next wave that was already on its way. Miles to the north, Lieutenant Commander Mike Blissett of 800 NAS was working through his own engagement. He found another dagger, locked it, fired, and watched it fall. The combat reports from that period describe engagements that lasted seconds. The gap between a locked tone and a destroyed aircraft was measured in heartbeats. The Argentine pilots, flying as fast and as low as their training demanded, had almost no time to react to a weapon that required no particular geometry to kill them. But some of them got through. That is the part of this story that the score does not tell. The Sea Harriers could not be everywhere simultaneously. 12 aircraft on 2 carriers flying missions that lasted finite amounts of time and required fuel and maintenance, and the physical limits of the pilots who flew them could not create an impenetrable ceiling over every approach vector at every moment of the day. The Argentine strike packages were large enough and frequent enough that some aircraft inevitably found gaps. HMS Ardent was struck multiple times and sank. Her crew suffered casualties that are numbers in a historical record and something entirely different to the families who received the news. HMS Antelope was hit. HMS Coventry would follow in the days ahead. The war was not clean from the British side. It was never going to be clean. There is no version of this campaign where the cost disappears into a comfortable final tally. What the Sea Harrier patrols did on the 21st of May was not eliminate the threat. It was reduce it, thin it, take enough aircraft out of each wave that the ships below could absorb the ones that broke through and keep functioning. The question was never whether some Argentine aircraft would reach their targets. The question was whether enough of them would reach their targets to break the operation entirely. And the answer to that question across that long and brutal day was no. By nightfall, the beachhead at San Carlos was established. British forces were ashore. The ground campaign had begun. There is something else about that day that almost never appears in the standard accounts of the air battle, something that sounds, when you first hear it, almost impossible to believe. It concerns the Argentine bombs that found their targets. Many of them did not explode. The Argentine pilots were attacking at very low altitude, precisely the kind of attack profile that makes aircraft hardest to intercept and hardest to shoot down with anti-aircraft guns, because the approach is fast and the engagement window is short. But that same low altitude created a different problem. Conventional bomb fuses need a minimum amount of time after release to arm themselves a safeguard against the bomb destroying the aircraft that dropped it. That arming time corresponds to a minimum altitude. Below that altitude, the fuse does not complete its arming cycle before impact. The Argentine pilots were flying below that altitude. Bombs struck HMS Ardent. Bombs struck HMS Antelope. Bombs struck other vessels in the Sound. Some of those bombs passed completely through the hulls of their targets and exited the other side without detonating. One analysis of the campaign conducted after the war suggested that if Argentine pilots had been equipped with delay fuses properly calibrated for low-level attack profiles, the number of British ships sunk in San Carlos water could have been 60 to 70% higher, enough to make the landing untenable, enough to change the outcome entirely. They were not equipped that way. History sits on details like that. The difference between what happened and what almost happened is sometimes a procurement decision about fuse specifications made years before the conflict by people who had no idea what they were preparing for. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. The Sea Harriers continued their work through the weeks following the landing. The ground campaign pushed steadily toward Stanley. Argentine forces on the island were isolated, cut off from the kind of resupply that might have extended the fighting indefinitely. Part of what isolated them was visible the naval blockade and the attrition of Argentine air power. Part of what isolated them was something stranger. It had to do with helicopters. The Argentine garrison on the Falklands depended heavily on helicopter operations for resupply and troop movement. There were no decent roads. The terrain was a series of peat bogs, rocky ridge lines, and exposed grassland that turned movement on foot or by vehicle into an exhausting and time-consuming exercise. Helicopters were the logistics system. Without them, units in the field ran short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. With them, a determined defense might hold for weeks beyond what was otherwise sustainable. The problem for Argentine helicopter crews was the Harrier. Not because the Harrier was especially fast, not because its radar gave it some decisive detection advantage over low-flying helicopters, but because of the same capability that had made it famous and made it feared, and made it in the end something genuinely without precedent in the history of military aviation. It could hover. A conventional jet fighter is predictable in one crucial sense. It moves. It has to keep moving forward to maintain lift and control. A helicopter crew listening for threats knows that a jet will approach with a certain acoustic signature at a certain speed following a trajectory that physics constrains to a limited set of options. You can hear it coming. You have seconds to respond. A Sea Harrier could sit behind a ridgeline, nozzles down, nearly motionless, invisible to radar at low altitude waiting. It could rise vertically above the terrain, acquire a target, and attack before the target had any meaningful warning. The hills and ridges and valleys of the Falklands, a landscape that seemed designed for concealment, became a hunting ground for aircraft that could use that terrain in ways no fixed-wing jet had ever been able to use it before. Argentine helicopter pilots knew this. The briefings told them. The losses confirmed it. Sea Harriers destroyed multiple Argentine helicopters in the air and in ground attacks on forward positions. But the larger effect was not the helicopters that were physically destroyed. It was the missions that were never flown. The resupply runs postponed to darkness. The troop movements delayed until weather reduced visibility enough to lower the risk. The slow accumulation of shortfalls in food, ammunition, and equipment at forward Argentine positions, because the supply chain that depended on helicopter mobility had been effectively strangled by the presence of an aircraft that could wait behind a rock. The jet-powered ambush predator. That is what the aircraft had become. The thing that everybody mocked at air shows for being slow and subsonic had turned itself into a weapon for which nothing in the Argentine inventory had a direct answer. Through those weeks, the RAF Harrier GR-3S from No. 1 Squadron were fighting their own version of the campaign, and it deserves its moment here because it tends to get crowded out by the more dramatic air-to-air story. The 10 GR-3S were not configured for dogfighting. They had no Blue Fox radar. They carried no Lama missiles. They were ground attack aircraft, and their job was to fly low and fast over defended Argentine positions and put ordnance exactly where the ground forces needed it. That job had a brutally simple risk profile. Low and fast over a defended position means flying through the effective engagement envelope of every anti-aircraft weapon the enemy has deployed. It means accepting that some percentage of the aircraft that go in will be hit, because physics does not allow you to fly that profile and remain completely unexposed. The GR-3 pilots flew those missions anyway. Over and over, 126 ground attack sorties in total against positions that were defended in weather that was frequently appalling, from carriers that were themselves moving through seas that never gave the pilots the stable reference points they would have had from a land base. 2 GR-3s were brought down by ground fire. Their pilots ejected into enemy-held territory and worked their way back to British lines through conditions that tested everything they had. They made it. The others kept flying. 4 days after the San Carlos landing on the 25th of May, the Atlantic Conveyor was still with the task force. Her aircraft were gone already, flying from the carriers already part of the campaign. But she was carrying something else the ground operation desperately needed. Heavy lift helicopters, Chinooks, the workhorses that were supposed to move men and supplies across terrain that had no roads and no easy passage once the beachhead was established. 2 Argentine Super Étendard aircraft found her in the late afternoon. They fired 2 AIM-39 Exocet missiles. The missiles found the ship. The Atlantic Conveyor caught fire with the particular ferocity of a vessel carrying aviation fuel and munitions, a fire that her civilian firefighting systems had never been built to fight. 12 of her crew were killed. Among them was her master, Captain Ian North, who had brought the ship and everything aboard her across the Atlantic and died with her in the water she had come to serve. The Chinooks burned with the ship, almost all of them. One had been airborne when the missile struck and was recovered. The rest were gone. What followed was not a change in outcome, but a change in cost. The logistics plan that depended on those helicopters had to be rewritten overnight. The men who needed to move across the Falklands moved on their feet. Thousands of Royal Marines and paratroopers marched 50, 60, 80 kilometers across peat bogs and rocky hillsides in freezing temperatures, carrying everything they needed on their backs, through days and nights that tested the outer boundary of what the body will accept when the mind has decided that stopping is not an option. They got where they needed to go, but they got there carrying a weight that 12 crew members of the Atlantic Conveyor had paid with their lives to spare them from carrying. The guns fell silent over Stanley on June 14, 1982. The Argentine commander surrendered. The war was over, 74 days after it started. The final air-to-air count, confirmed by post-war analysis and referenced by the Defense Technical Information Center, stood at 20 Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. 0 Sea Harriers lost to enemy fighter action. Some analyses, depending on which specific claims survive close examination, place the total at 21 or 23. The targets destroyed included Mirage 3, EAIAI daggers, A4, Skyhawks of the Bravo and Charlie variants, an English Electric Canberra bomber, a Lockheed C-130, Hercules transport aircraft, an Air Mach-E MB-339, and a Puma helicopter caught in flight. 6 Sea Harriers were lost during the conflict, 2 to ground fire or surface-to-air missiles, 4 to operational accidents, including a mid-air collision in poor weather and controlled flight into terrain in the brutal visibility conditions of the South Atlantic. Not 1 to an enemy fighter. In the entire history of jet combat, from the first Korean engagements in 1950 through every air campaign fought in the decades since, no aircraft operating at such numerical disadvantage, in such difficult conditions, against such varied and capable opposition, had produced a comparable result. The closest equivalent most historians reach for is the Pacific turkey shoots of the Second World War, and even those involved aircraft from the same technological generation as their opponents, not a subsonic machine dismissed by its own government, facing a force built around supersonic interceptors. The world took notice with a speed and completeness that reflected how dramatic the result actually was. India finalized orders for the Sea Harrier FERS-51. Their aircraft would be operated from INS Virat, the vessel the Indian Navy had acquired from Britain, which happened to be HMS Hermes herself. The same ship from which Andy Auld and 800 NAS had flown their missions throughout the campaign would now carry Indian pilots on Indian operations. The old carrier continued to serve under a different flag for decades more. Spain acquired the AV-8B Harrier II. Italy ordered AV-8Bs for the Marina Militare. Thailand later acquired former Spanish aircraft for its own small carrier. The orders came quickly and without the ambivalence that had characterized the pre-Falklands market for VTOL aircraft. The most consequential shift happened in Washington. The United States Marine Corps had been flying the first-generation AEV-8A since the early 1970s, and throughout that period had endured a particular kind of institutional skepticism from the Air Force and Navy communities who regarded the whole vertical takeoff concept with a condescension that had become conventional wisdom. The AV-8B Harrier II program, a substantially redesigned second-generation aircraft developed jointly by McDonnell Douglas and British Aerospace, had been grinding through development under exactly this atmosphere of doubt. The Falklands result made that doubt impossible to sustain in any serious conversation. The AV-8B entered Marine Corps service in 1985 and became the Corps' primary light attack aircraft for 3 decades. It flew in the Gulf War of 1991. It flew in Afghanistan. It flew in Iraq. 30 years of operational service, all of it traceable in a direct line back to 20 aircraft operating from 2 small carriers in the worst weather in the Southern Hemisphere in the spring and early summer of 1982. In London, John Knott's planned sale of HMS Invincible to Australia was quietly set aside. The Sea Harrier force was enhanced rather than reduced. The aircraft was eventually upgraded to the FA. 2 standard equipped with the Blue Vixen pulse Doppler report radar that was everything the original Blue Fox had not been, and armed with the AIM-120 AIM-RAM, a beyond visual range missile that transformed the Sea Harrier from a capable close-in fighter into something that could engage targets at distances that would have seemed like science fiction to the pilots who flew the original FRS-1 into battle. The aircraft that Britain's own government had been preparing to abandon became the centerpiece of Royal Navy air power for another 20 years. Falklands did not just vindicate the Harrier, it saved it. But here is where the story turns, and this turn is the part that takes a certain kind of courage to sit with, honestly, because it does not resolve cleanly into triumph. Remember the name, the one that started this story, the one the pilots themselves used. Not the museum name, not the poster name. The United States Marine Corps. The men who flew the AV-8A through the 1970s and into the 1980s gave it a name that has nothing to do with combat victory or technical achievement or the revolutionary elegance of vectored thrust. They called it the Scarier. It is not a compliment. It is not a term of pride in the way that a fighting unit takes pride in a hard reputation. It is a confession. The word comes from scary because that is what it was. Pilots describe the aircraft becoming squirrely during transition, and in aviation, squirrely is never a word that refers to something pleasant. It refers to the particular and visceral instability that can develop when a machine with complex aerodynamic demands and limited tolerance for error encounters a moment that falls outside the narrow corridor of conditions it was designed to handle cleanly. Pilots who flew the Harrier described being scared to death during vertical operations. Not in the way that brave people acknowledge the existence of fear and then set it aside. In the way that the fear was present and specific and attached to a clear and immediate physical reality. The first-generation AV-8A earned another name alongside Scarier, the Lawn Dart, because that is what it looked like going in, and it went in with a frequency that the official accounts of the period handle carefully because the numbers are genuinely difficult to absorb in the context of the aircraft's celebrated combat record. Roughly 1/3 of all AV-8A and TAV-8A airframes delivered to the United States Marine Corps were destroyed in non-combat accidents. 1/3, not in war, not under fire, lost in training operations and routine flights in the specific and repeated hazard of single-engine vertical flight performed by men who were skilled and experienced and still sometimes not fast enough to overcome the physics. To understand why you have to think carefully about what a conventional aircraft offers its pilot that the Harrier does not. A twin-engine jet loses an engine and continues to fly. A conventional aircraft that stalls has altitude, and altitude is time and time is the thing that allows training and instinct to find the answer. Every safety margin in conventional aircraft design assumes some version of the same thing, that when something goes wrong, there is a buffer between the initial problem and the fatal outcome. A second engine, some remaining altitude, a few hundred feet of runway still ahead. The Harrier during vertical operations had none of those buffers. One engine, no forward speed generating lift over the wings. If the Pegasus developed a problem at 50 feet in a hover, and problems happen to engines, turbine blades crack, and fuel controllers malfunction, and compressor stalls occur in conditions that no one predicted, the pilot was sitting in a machine that had just become a very heavy, very fast-moving object with no aerodynamic solution available to it. The ejection seat was there, and it was good equipment, and it saved lives. But at 50 feet in a hover, it required a precision of timing and a quality of luck that could not always be counted on. The pilots who flew the Harrier knew all of this. It was not hidden from them. It was part of the machine they had chosen to fly, or in many cases been assigned to fly, and they flew it anyway because the mission required it, and because they were the kind of people who do not decline necessary things simply because those things are dangerous. 4 of the 6 Sea Harriers lost in the Falklands campaign itself were lost to operational causes rather than enemy action. A mid-air collision in the weather that characterizes the South Atlantic in May. Controlled flight into terrain when visibility dropped below safe margins. These were not failures of courage. They were not failures of skill. They were the tax that this aircraft has always levied on the people who operate it, the toll extracted not by any enemy, but by the fundamental physics of what it means to hover a single-engine jet in conditions that do not forgive imprecision. The men who won the air war over the Falklands proved every critic wrong about what this aircraft could do in combat. The men who died in peacetime accidents, training, sorties, and routine flights in the years before and after doing nothing more dramatic than the daily work of maintaining a military aviation capability proved that the critics were not entirely wrong about the cost. Both things are true simultaneously. About the same aircraft, about the same 4 rotating nozzles that made everything possible and extracted everything in return. The men who lived inside that gap between the glory and the cost had already given it a name. Scarier, not a joke, a description. And now we come to the moment that contains everything. Not the air-to-air record, not the global orders that followed the victory. The moment that holds the full truth of this machine in a single image on a single night over a dark ocean, involving one young pilot who had never seen combat and one cargo ship that was not designed for what was about to happen to it. His name was Ian Watson, Sub-Lieutenant Ian Watson of 899 Naval Air Squadron, Royal Navy. The men he served with called him Soapy. He was not a Falklands veteran. He had not been in the South Atlantic. He was a young pilot in the post-war fleet, flying training sorties from HMS Dorothy Illustrious as the ship operated in the Atlantic. On a night in the autumn of 1983, more than a year after the guns went quiet over Stanley Watson took off on a routine training flight. His radio stopped working. His navigation systems could not reacquire the carrier. He was alone above the Atlantic Ocean at night with no communication and no reliable position fix, and the fuel gauge was moving in only one direction. He ran the standard emergency procedures. Pilots train for equipment failures the way surgeons train for complications methodically and repeatedly until the response becomes reflexive rather than deliberate. Watson worked through the checklist with the discipline his training had built into him. Nothing changed. The radio stayed silent. The navigation systems stayed unreliable. The fuel gauge continued its patient, indifferent descent. The calculation was simple and merciless. A conventional jet pilot in this situation faces a set of options that narrow quickly. You try to find the carrier through dead reckoning, flying a search pattern, based on your last known position and estimated drift. If that fails, you look for a diversion airfield somewhere on land within range where you can put the aircraft down safely. If both of those fail, and if the fuel runs out before any other solution presents itself, you initiate ejection. You pull the handle, the seat fires, and you descend on a parachute into the ocean at night and wait to be found. That last option is not a good option. The North Atlantic at night in autumn is not forgiving. Ejecting into the ocean in those conditions is surviving in the statistical sense, meaning some percentage of people who do it live, but it is not a plan that any pilot approaches with confidence. Watson looked at his fuel gauge. He looked at the darkness below him. And then through the canopy, he saw something. Light, not the carrier, not a diversion airfield, not anything that appeared in any version of the emergency procedures he had memorized. A ship, a civilian vessel moving through the Atlantic on whatever course it had been following before a Royal Navy Sea Harrier began describing orbits in the sky above it. The lights were small from altitude, but they were there, and they were the only lights in a very large and very dark piece of ocean. Watson flew lower to look at it. What he saw was the M. Valrigo, a cargo vessel registered in Spain, somewhere between her port of origin and her destination, carrying whatever her manifest said she was carrying, and crewed by men who had absolutely no expectation that the next hour of their lives would be unusual in any way. She was not a large ship by commercial standards. She was certainly not a warship. Her deck was a working cargo deck, meaning it was covered with containers and equipment and the general organized clutter of a vessel designed to move freight efficiently rather than to receive aircraft. She had no approach lighting system. She had no deck crew trained in aircraft recovery. She had no equipment of any kind designed to assist a jet aircraft in landing aboard her. And she was moving through Atlantic swells that were not dramatic, but were constant, the kind of steady ocean motion that makes every surface aboard a ship rise and fall and roll through a continuous three-dimensional pattern that never quite repeats. Watson looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the El Rigo. The thought that formed in his mind was not complicated. It was, in fact, quite simple. It was also, by any conventional measure of what a jet aircraft is supposed to do, completely insane. He could hover. That was the thought. Not an analysis, not a multi-stage decision tree, just the recognition of a fact about the machine he was flying that no other fighter pilot alive could have applied to this situation. Every other fast jet in any inventory anywhere would have continued past that ship without slowing, because slowing to the speed required for a deck landing was impossible, and because that ship had no catapult, no arresting gear, and no usable runway of any length. Every other pilot would have kept flying until the fuel ran out and then ejected and hoped. Watson began his approach. What he was attempting had no name in any training manual, because it had never been contemplated as a training scenario. You cannot write a procedure for something that should not be possible. The Harrier's vertical landing capability was designed and tested and refined for use on purpose-built surfaces and naval flight decks equipped with specific markings in lighting and deck crews who understood their role in the process airfields with proper approach, aids, temporary operating surfaces that had been surveyed and prepared. The Arrigo's deck had none of these things. What it had was a surface approximately flat in the sections not occupied by containers covered in the salt residue and weather staining of a working cargo ship moving in 3 dimensions simultaneously according to the rhythm of the Atlantic. Watson brought the Sea Harrier into a hover. The Pegasus engine, the same engine that had been killing pilots in training accidents for 15 years, the same engine whose failure at low altitude was the engineering reality, at the heart of every accident report in the files, was now the only thing standing between Watson and the ocean. One engine, no forward speed. No altitude to spare. Just the column of thrust from 4 rotating nozzles holding 9 tons of aircraft 50 feet above a deck that was not there for this purpose. He began to descend. The ship was moving. Not dramatically, but moving. The deck rose toward him and then fell away and then rose again, and each of those movements changed the geometry of what he was doing in ways that required continuous correction. A hover that works perfectly over a stationary surface becomes something else entirely, over a surface that shifts beneath you, because every correction you make is chasing a target that has already moved to a new position by the time your correction takes effect. The control inputs required are small and fast and must be exactly right, because in a hover at low altitude, there is no margin. There is no altitude to absorb an error. There is no airspeed to trade for time. The deck of the El Rigo rose toward him on a swell. Watson was descending. The timing was not perfect. The Sea Harrier touched down not on the flat deck surface, but on top of a shipping container. The container, a steel box designed to hold cargo, was not designed to hold a 9-ton jet aircraft settling onto it from above. When the El Rigo rolled in the swell and the aircraft shifted with the motion of the ship, the rear fuselage of the Sea Harrier slid backward off the container's edge and dropped onto the deck below. The container partially collapsed under the impact. The aircraft's tail section struck the deck and with the force of something very heavy falling a short distance, which is exactly what it was. Metal deformed. The rear of the airframe crumpled where it had dropped. The Sea Harrier came to rest in a posture that no aircraft is designed to occupy: nose-elevated tail, low surrounded by buckled container steel, and the debris of a landing that nothing in the design specifications had anticipated. Watson shut down the engine. He sat in the cockpit for a moment. The silence was different from the silence in the air. This silence had the particular quality of aftermath of something having just been decided, of physics having taken its course and arrived at a conclusion that was better than it might have been. He climbed out. He stood on the deck of the M. Arrigo, a Spanish cargo ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the dark, surrounded by crumpled metal and a destroyed aircraft, listening to the sound of the ocean and the ship's engines and the voices of the Arrigo's crew coming from somewhere nearby. Men who had heard something extraordinary happen on their deck and were coming to find out what it was. Watson was alive. He was alive because his aircraft could hover. He was alive because the same Pegasus engine that had sent so many pilots into accident reports and memorial services had not on this night chosen this moment to demonstrate its capacity for failure. He was alive because the particular combination of skill and nerve and the fundamental capability of the machine had been enough, just barely enough, to get him from the air to a surface before the fuel ran out. The aircraft was destroyed. Z-176, the Sea Harrier he had flown that night, was finished as an operational aircraft. The airframe damage was too extensive for repair to be economical. It would never fly again. But the pilot walked away. The photographs taken when daylight came are among the most remarkable images in the history of British naval aviation. A Sea Harrier nose angled upward, where the tail had dropped, sitting among shipping containers on a Spanish cargo vessel in the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by the evidence of a landing that should not have been survivable and perhaps should not have been attempted, and was both of those things simultaneously. The containers around it bear the marks of an impact that was controlled only in the loosest sense of that word. The ship's deck, never designed for anything like this, shows the traces of 9 tons arriving uninvited in the night. Nobody cheers when they look at that photograph. There is no version of the image that resolves into triumph. What it shows is something more specific and more honest than triumph. It shows the absolute boundary of what was possible. Watson found that boundary in the dark with an empty fuel gauge and no better options, and he did not go past it. He stopped right at the edge of it. The machine allowed him to stop there, and then it paid the price for doing so, and the man walked away. That is the Harrier in one image. Everything it was and everything it cost in a single frame. The Sea Harrier served the Royal Navy until 2006. 26 years from its introduction to its retirement, bookended by 2 careers that could not have been more different in their public profile. The first ended in the South Atlantic in 1982 with a kill record that still has no equal in the history of jet combat. The second was the long, ordinary work of deterrence and presence and training, the kind of work that military aviation mostly consists of, the work that does not generate headlines, but keeps the capability alive and the skills sharp and the chain of knowledge moving from the pilots who knew the aircraft to the pilots who were learning it. Throughout that second career, the accident rate never became acceptable in the way that the accident rates of conventional aircraft become acceptable. The Harrier was always more dangerous than its counterparts. The physics never changed. The single engine remained single. The hover remained the hover, with all its demands and all its consequences when those demands were not met precisely. Every pilot who flew it knew this. Every pilot who flew it made a calculation. Perhaps not in those explicit terms, but in the way that the body knows things, the conscious mind prefers not to articulate about what they were accepting in exchange for what they were able to do. The question that history keeps returning to, and that has no clean answer, is whether that exchange was worth it. The men who won the Falklands Air War would say yes without hesitation. Ward would say yes. Auld would say yes. Barton would say yes. Every pilot who came home from those 74 days would look at the result and tell you that they flew the right aircraft and that the outcome justified the machine. The families of pilots who did not come home from training accidents in Virginia Beach or in the North Sea or on flight decks during peacetime operations would measure the exchange differently. They are not wrong to do so. Their measurement is not less valid than the pilot's measurement. It is just made from a different position, standing in a different kind of aftermath, looking at a different kind of result. The United States Marine Corps retired its last AV-8B Harrier II in 2026 after more than 50 years of American vertical takeoff and landing fast jet capability that traced its lineage directly back to the P-1127 tethered hover at Dunsfold in October 1960. 50 years is a long time for any aircraft design concept to remain operationally relevant. The Harrier concept lasted that long because the problem it solved, the need for a fast jet that does not require prepared runways, never went away. Every conflict in that 50-year span confirmed the value of the capability. The aircraft that the Argentine intelligence analysts called an insignificant threat outlasted most of the aircraft that were at the time considered the real threats. The original Sea Harrier FRS-1S that flew in the Falklands are gone now. Some are in museums, standing on their landing gear in climate-controlled halls, polished and placarded and visited by people who were not yet born when they flew into combat. If you stand in front of one of them and look at the four nozzles and think about what they meant, the machine will tell you two things simultaneously and with equal force. It will tell you about the morning of May 1st, 1982, in a gray South Atlantic sky, in a mirage tumbling in fire because a weapon found it from an angle that should have been safe. And it will tell you about the accident reports, the quiet accumulation of them, the names that appear in records rather than in headlines, the pilots who did everything right and were still in the wrong moment when the Pegasus decided that this was the hover from which it would not recover. A machine that demands the highest possible price for the highest possible capability is not a simple thing to love. The men who flew the Harrier loved it anyway. Not innocently, not without knowing what they were loving. They loved it the way that people love anything that has shown them both the best and the worst of what is possible, that has taken them somewhere extraordinary and extracted something irreplaceable in return. Sharkey Ward flew it and wrote about it and argued about it for the rest of his life with the particular intensity of a man who has never resolved his feelings about something that meant everything to him. Andy Auld led his squadron with the quiet competence of someone who understood exactly what he was responsible for and carried that responsibility without drama. Paul Barton fired the first shot and went back to the Royal Air Force and took with him the knowledge of what it felt like to be in that particular sky on that particular morning with that particular weapon under his wing. Soapy Watson climbed out of a wrecked aircraft on the deck of a Spanish cargo ship and continued his career and carried with him something that no training exercise and no debrief and no amount of time would ever quite put into ordinary language. He had found the edge. He had stopped at it. The machine had let him stop at it, and then the machine was gone and he was still there. That is the story, not the version that ends with the kill score on a museum wall, though the kill score belongs in the story, not the version that begins and ends with 20 aircraft defeating 82, though that belongs in the story too. The full version, the one that holds both hands open at the same time and shows you what is in each one without asking you to choose which matters more. That is the Harrier, the whole truth of it, the story that should have been told a long time ago.